All right, good afternoon, everyone. May I join Sally in welcoming everyone to the webinar. My name is Bryce, Doherty. I'm from UBS Asset Management. I'm joined by Stephen Glenfield from FASEA. Am I saying that correctly, Stephen?
There's about 400 different versions.
I've noticed that.
But I like yours.
And I've got Dante Gori from the FPA, which is very easy to pronounce. So welcome, guys. Good to see you here. Very fair to say that it's been a interesting 12 to 36 months for our whole industry. I think that, some of the things that Sally just mentioned there are going to be very good topics to get your opinions on. Maybe we can start with the fact that even before the Royal Commission, we know that there was major changes happening in the financial planning sector. We know that the average age of financial planners was moving up. We know that there were a number of people looking to retire, and succession plans were a big topic. And the idea of bringing in enough people at the bottom, if you will, to replace those financial planners who are heading to retirement was already a challenge. Coupled with that, there was already increasing education requirements coming through. And then just when everyone was starting to deal with all of that, we had the Royal Commission fly in on top. So maybe if we start with you, Dante, just on your view of that question that Sally just posed, which is, how are we going to ensure that there are enough financial planners to look after Australians going forward?
Yes, it's a good question. It's actually a complicated question. I mean, so we have to be very mindful about what type of profession we want in financial planning going forward. And I think the education standards, the framework that's been regulated or legislated to be implemented, which includes education and ongoing CPD examination and a code of ethics, as well as a standard professional year requirement, is actually a good thing. So it's really important. They're the hallmarks of setting up a profession. Now, in order to achieve the objective of having a profession and the occupation of financial planning and advice to be treated as a profession, there are some sacrifices that need to be made in order to get there. So, and unfortunately, one of the impacts is the inflow or the supply chain of future financial planners. That is without a doubt. Just look at some sort of raw numbers during the 2009 parliamentary inquiry, the Ripoll inquiry. It was recorded there to have about 18,000 financial planners. The financial advisor register at the end of 2018 registered 29,000. So there's been phenomenal growth in the number of individuals who have become financial advisors, but the process of entering into the profession has been a very low bar. And so this does correct that. It does make it more difficult. You need a degree qualification and you need to complete a minimum 12-month professional year. And I don't think anyone on the webinar today or anyone in the entire financial industry would disagree that that is an appropriate process. However, the fact remains is that the supply chain has diminished substantially as a result because of that barrier. So what are we doing about it, or what can we do about it? Well, our key here is entertaining the next generation of financial planners through the school system, the university system. And the universities now have a key role to play because you have to do a qualification through them in order to become a financial planner, where before they were cut out of the system. And so they present a key, and we need to be able to encourage and sell the profession of financial planning to future generations, but also continue to advocate for people within financial services where a career change into financial planning is still worthwhile. Many of the financial planners that joined the profession in years gone by were actually career changers. So that's still a market, but you just need to do a bit more than what you needed to do before in order to get in there. So that's our target. It is a slow burn, and it will something we have to invest in now, and we all need to invest in that now in order to get the benefits in the long term.
So I think there are a couple of interesting points there, Dante. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree that having a higher professional standard, no one would disagree that that's a good thing. I do sometimes think, though, that as an industry, or people outside the industry forget how we got here. And, when superannuation became compulsory in 1992, there needed to be a cohort of people to implement that on behalf of the government, and therefore traditional life insurance agents were the people that were embraced to do that, and they've done a great job of doing that. and it is good that, as the profession moves on, it becomes more professional. What can we do, though, as far as working with universities to encourage kids coming out doing their HSC right now to think about this? Because I think that, the research that I've always seen says that anyone who has a financial planner rates that financial planner very highly. But if you ask people a general question around what do you think of financial planners, it's not so good. How do we rebrand this into being a thing that we would be wanting kids coming out of high school to be thinking about going into?
Look, it's a challenge. There isn't a silver bullet there, and I don't have the magical solution. But what I would say is one of the things that attracts university students to a profession is the opportunity for jobs. And the opportunity for jobs in financial planning is huge. I mean, you talked about at the start in terms of the fact that we got some challenges, and there are an ageing population in the financial planning sector where advisors have made decisions or will make decisions to leave as a result of pure retirement and or because of choosing not to meet the new standards, or other factors due to licensee decisions or grandfather commissions, etc. So for a number of reasons people are leaving. The demand for advice is actually increasing, and we have independent research now from the regulator ASIC that confirms 40% of Australians actually need financial advice or want to get financial advice. So the demand's there. So therefore we need more planners, and so therefore the job opportunity is there. So we need to sell to university students, one, that it's a career which has which has a professional standing, great reputation, and also great opportunities in terms of employment.
Totally agree. And I think it's the whole financial services industry's responsibility to participate in that. Changing a little bit and thinking about, the other thing that we are seeing happening rapidly, and that is the changing role of the licensee. Wondering, Stephen, from your opinion of what's happened in the last couple of years, but particularly since the Royal Commission, where do you see the licensee fitting in the future state of advice?
Yeah, the licensee, I think, has a huge role in that future state of advice. And if you look at, if you take the changes to the Corps Act that were made that brought FASEA in, whilst they're targeted at the individual advisor, there is a big role for the licensee in terms of providing the ongoing training or organising the ongoing work program for those advisors. So one of our big elements is CPD and having a formalised CPD. A key to that is actually what we're looking for is that CPD is targeted to the needs of that advisor, and it's the licensee will be in a position to work with the advisor to understand what they need and to provide that going forward. The licensees clearly have a big role in the professional year. So what you're going to have in the future when the trust is there, and then, as Dante said, and the jobs are there, the universities are already stepping up. We've approved a large number of degrees that will be for financial planning advice going forward. Once people come into that, part of the appeal is actually about joining a profession with a professional year is to work with an experienced advisor through their licensee to actually ground them and train them and make them a good advisor going forward. And you've also got the role as a licensee in providing a work structure or remuneration structure that helps those advisors meet their requirements under the new Act. So around the code of ethics and all of that, the licensee has a significant role to play in that going forward.
And how do you see the education standards being implemented? I know that Minister Jane Hume has sort of moved the deadline down a little bit. Just any comments on whether that's a positive thing?
I think it's positive in that, this is a big change for a lot of people, particularly existing advisors that in many cases haven't studied for a long time. The extension of time gives you a period to actually plan for it. In terms of what's being offered out there, we're actually seeing record numbers of people signing up to do those degrees. So the higher education providers are reporting to us there are significant numbers of advisors signing up. One in particular mentioned to me they had 6,500 people signed up to do courses. So again, I think that's a credit to the industry itself, in that people are saying, okay, I now know I need to do this. I've got clarity around what I need to do, and they're going ahead and doing it. And in terms of professionalism, the hallmarks of a profession is a level of education. It's an ongoing training requirement, and it's ongoing ethical requirements. This is all, to me, adds to bringing back trust to the profession, which ultimately opens up to more people coming to join, because the more Australians are wanting to use planners and advisors, the more appealing that becomes to people through the university.
Yeah.
I'd agree that the demand for advice has never been higher. I mean, there's depending on whose figures you listen to, but 700 people plus per day retiring in Australia. And we know the one thing that hasn't changed is that at certain milestones in people's lives is when they need advice. And clearly retirement is a massive milestone. And hopefully they've had advice before that, because clearly an advisor can provide a lot more value earlier than at the point of retirement. But we are seeing more and more people retire. One of the issues that I'm hearing from advisors is the increase in the professional standards, the increase in compliance costs means it's now costing, depending on which advisor I speak to, between $10,000 to $20,000 to open a file. And with that being the case, do you think that we're heading into a period where, although the demand for advice is increasing rapidly, it's actually being put further and further out of reach of a number of Australians because of just even cost recovery?
Yeah. Look, I think that is a danger, and it is. We are now hearing language of the advice gap that potentially is occurring, and look, it's for a number of reasons, and some of it is needed. As I said, I mean that this sort of to professionalise the occupation of financial planning, the education standards is important, but that does have impacts. Regulation around Royal Commission impacts are also adding additional cost. Since the Royal Commission, there is a greater emphasis and scrutiny about compliance from licensees. And the regulator is really, putting a lot of pressure on licensees, and that is now resulting in, higher levels of internal compliance, the use of third-party compliance auditors. That's all adding layers of cost. I mean, I had this, about a year or so ago, one licensee was telling me they almost had a compliance officer per advisor. But that is not sustainable, right? It's ridiculous. So the pendulum has swung too far one way in terms of the compliance regime for good reason in some respects, because we weren't doing the best job. But it can't be sustained that way, because all that's going to do is drive further costs, and then to the end consumer, the inability to actually access advice. So we do have to be careful. I do think it will turn around. I do think there's opportunities to be more efficient at what we do, also to be less conservative. I mean, this might be a bit hard for some licensees and especially compliance officers, but I think we have been too overly conservative about what we do in terms of things like SOA documents, as an example. I mean, 100-page SOA documents is not beneficial to anybody, and because they become legal documents to defend us when something goes wrong, as opposed to being a financial plan that a consumer can use. And so we have to get this balance right. Obviously, technology, everyone talks about it. It's not the panacea, but we have to better use technology to make the process more efficient. I mean, fact-finding processes, some of those fact-finding questions should be automatically filled, and move and spend more time with the client, talking and engaging with the client about them. That's not written down on a financial statement. So there are ways, and the technology is coming about to help make it more efficient. But I think, going back to your point, is it a risk? Is it an area that we need to concentrate on? Absolutely. I think we need to have a regime where a consumer can access advice at any level, and any consumer can access advice. I think it's almost, I would go as far as saying that it's almost a human right to be able to access advice of some form, because every Australian, every citizen of Australia should have the opportunity and capacity to access advice as much as they have access to medical and legal advice. I think they should have access to financial advice.
Yeah, I agree with Dante. It's always a balancing act between lifting standards through regulation and maintaining accessibility and affordability. Some of the cost is in the first move to get to the new level, and you'd hope that would balance out over time, but it's clearly an area that has to be retained. And it's particularly important. We were just touching on the retirement of people and access. I put my old hat on for a previous role around superannuation. You're now coming to the point where the first group of people who are in the compulsory super from day one are reaching retirement.
Mm-hmm.
So their balances that they're coming out with now are way in excess of what you would have seen 10 years ago. So the importance of that financial advice to that going forward becomes even more critical, so that advice has to be available.
Dante brought up technological solutions, and I definitely am on record as saying that I feel like robo advice gets thrown around very easily with not a lot of substance behind it. I know that in the UK, as an example, there was absolutely no panacea when they had their changes in their market environment over there. That suddenly robo advice solved this problem. But in saying that, what you're getting at there, Dante, is there are technological solutions at the advisor level, probably at the licensee level, to help make things more efficient. Are you seeing that being embedded into your members?
Yes and no. So there's I think there is definitely an appetite to better understand and a desire to implement better technology solutions in practices, and the licensees are definitely looking at this space as well. It's difficult for a couple of reasons. One, there is so much choice. So one of the issues that we have is that every startup fintech company wants to get a shoe in the door, and also have designed, have come up with a very niche solution to a problem, or a problem to a niche, a solution to a niche problem. And most advice practices are looking for a more holistic solution. You also don't know which of these fintechs are going to be around tomorrow. When we started looking at this space a couple of years ago, there was 400 plus fintechs that claimed to do something in financial advice. Half of those don't exist today. So it is difficult. It's overwhelming. And most advisors aren't experts in picking technology solutions. Most of the software solutions have been dealt with at the licensee level. And I think even licensees, and they're all different stages, but some licensees would probably admit that they are also overwhelmed knowing what to go for and what technology to go for. And also there is a bit of a dilemma between advisor and licensee, where some practices want to pick their own solution, where the licensees, for their role in terms of monitoring and supervision, it makes a lot of sense where there is consistent use of technology across their advisors. So the desire is there, the want is there, and the will is there, but it is actually a lot more complicated in terms of the decision-making process and deciding on the right solution. We had last week at our Congress, we did have a number of fintechs showcase what they can do in the SOA space. And again, I just think the opportunity is there, and it is inevitable that the technology is going to play a big role in the running of an advice practice and the running of a licensee from both end to end. So including the client experience all the way through to reg tech.
From one of your earlier comments, I do wonder whether that's, in essence, the tail wagging the dog. And rather than getting a fintech solution to help you with the SOA, we need to actually completely redesign what the SOA is in the first instance. And some of the technological solutions that we see out there are solving a problem when the problem could probably be solved itself and made more simple.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges I think that we have here in Australia is that although we've got a huge superannuation system and everyone's in it, we're still a relatively small population. So some of the advice software that I've seen in the US in particular, the vendors just are not interested in coming to Australia because the market's not big enough. Our tax system's complex. Our super system is actually very complex. It seems every time we get a new government, and sometimes even when we don't get a new government, they want to change and tinker with something around it. So it does make it difficult for advisors to get that kind of scale technology solution running in their businesses, and for licensees as well.
Yes, no, that is absolutely a problem, and it's a difficult one. We are in a bit of a unique scenario, and also the going back to your point about robo advice, the realization from these fintechs is that they know that consumers aren't knocking down their door to use their services. So it's the advisor channel that they need to sell their software through. But to your point, then it comes to scale and cost and complexity, and there's a lot there to be resolved.
What about using technology, Stephen, to deliver education and to help lift those professional standards?
Yeah, I mean, there is no objection to that. I think it's a great way learning. And I mean, even if you look at the university courses that are available today, my old head of university talks about you go to lectures and you sit in, but most of this stuff is available online now. And so you can either study by going or study in your own time. So I think it's the way to go, but it's got to be tailored to the audience that you're dealing with. And that sort of goes back to what I spoke about earlier on the CPD, is getting the right training to the advisors that meets their needs, and that can easily be tailored through. And
then, of course, the professional year plays a very important role. You can go and study online, you can get your qualification online, but you still actually have to be immersed in a business with a professional practitioner for a year.
Yeah, agree. And that's where you learn the practice. You know, it's universities do a wonderful job of filling you with knowledge and information of the role and the job and what advice is about and what the law says, but it can't replace actually going to work and working with someone who's highly skilled and is able to pass that on to you.
And so a question that's just come through, Stephen, for you is when do you expect an update on the guidelines for the Code of Ethics? And secondly, will there be industry consultation prior to that being released?
Nice question, and common question I'm getting at the moment. So we've just been through a round of consultation, and we're actually still meeting some groups and talking and sought feedback on it. The amount of feedback we've received has been outstanding. There's a lot of it to come through. So our role over the next few weeks is to distill that down into the common themes and common questions, and then think about what's the best way to get a response to that out. Part of that will be looking at the guidelines themselves and thinking about updating those. And I think I commented at the FPA conference that the approach taken by ASIC and by AFCA actually gives us time to do that in a considered fashion. So I think there will be ongoing consultation with industry. I'm certainly looking, though, to get something out in December that will hit some of the really hot button items. What form that will come in, we will work through. It's just there's a lot of information coming in, but within for a relatively short time in the future, I would look at a new set of guidelines and consulting on those guidelines as well.
Okay. Yep. How far and wide is that consultation going?
At present, so if you look at the last round, we consulted with higher education providers, consumer groups, we consulted with associations, we consulted with licensees, we've taken consultation in from individual advisors. There's been a large amount of that coming in, which has been really good. And I would expect that we would continue in that wide breadth, because if you think about FASEA's role, FASEA is not there to represent one group or another. We are there to represent all the stakeholders across it, so that it's important that we hear all the voices. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Dante, coming off the conference, the convention, the last couple of weeks, what's the mood like? How are your members feeling?
Yeah, look, again, I have to put it in context. So this, if I take the Congress last week in particular, these are members that have engaged, who chosen to participate in it. The vibe was very positive. There was definitely, a lot in attendance wanting to hear from Stephen and from ASIC and from AFCA in terms of the Code of Ethics, obviously. But in general, people wanted the information, but they were very, I have to say, positive. Many were very, looking at sort of what are the opportunities, what do I need to do? I just need to know what's going on so I can get on with it. But also have to, that was a sentiment of the conference, which was very pleasing. It doesn't mean that there aren't advisors who, are anxious and concerned and stressed, because I still feel those calls. So there are advisors in different positions depending on, where they are, depending on where they are in terms of education study, depending where they are in terms of their, their current licensee position, depending where they are around grandfather commissions, and just in general around their business. So there is a spectrum. So I don't want people on the call thinking that advisors are all positive and everything's happy. There are a group that are, but there's also definitely a group who, are doing it very tough. We're very conscious of those and trying to provide as much support as we can for them. But, probably the one thing that I have to say for everybody, even with these extension of time, with the education standards and with the exam, get in early. So the ones that are actually positive. I mean, for example, they've done the exam and they've passed. The relief from, is immense, and they feel like they can, sort of take on any challenges. So the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be. And so that's the message: get in early. You've got more time. That just gives you that time in case things go wrong, or you need to reset, or unforeseen circumstances that might pop up in the future. If you start early, you give yourself that breathing space. And that is not only on the study, but also if you need to rejig your business model, relook at your value proposition, et cetera, do it, start it now.
I mean, you mentioned earlier before, Stephen, that for some people, I don't even include myself, I haven't studied for a long time, and it's quite a daunting prospect to say, okay, all of a sudden I'm going to go and do this.
Yep.
And I know for some of the advisors that I speak to who are sort of in their 50s, mid-50s in particular, it's been a very long time since they've had to do study, and yet they are running exceptional businesses with exceptional service for their clients. Do you think that, first question is, do you think that cohort have been looked after well enough to get through it?
Look, in putting in what we put in, we've tried to be as balanced as we can be. The challenge in doing it is you've got to change to the law, which is actually a raising of standards, and it puts in a floor at that bachelor level or higher as a qualification. And it also puts in a requirement to pass an exam, and that's codified. So what we've tried to do for the exam, as an example, I've been really consistent in saying what we're trying to do is set a fair exam that a competent advisor can pass regardless of their specialisation. And we're really, really careful with the questions to make that take place. And the results we've had today, and I think when I spoke at the FPA, you look at a 90% pass rate on the first one, 88% pass rate on the second one, and that's been consistent across specialisation. There's no particular group that's really done better than any other, and it's been consistent through ages. So I think to an extent we are putting out an exam that's reasonably fair, and people are starting to have some faith in doing it. We've got the next round start tomorrow, and there's actually over 3,000 advisors going to sit this round of exams, which, to Dante's point about getting on with it, I think is really pleasing for advisors, because I did a session at the FPA, and the relief in those who've actually passed is really positive.
What is the pass rate at the moment?
So at the moment, there's 90% pass the first exam and 88% pass the second exam.
Right.
And I've said consistently, there's no bell curve, there's no aim to have a certain percentage not get through.
And so on those
That's
numbers,
a competency test.
Reality, everyone's getting through.
Well,
close to
9 in 10 at this point.
Okay, which is good.
And then on the education, for that's been a challenge. The one thing we did do for existing advisors was say we don't expect you to do a bachelor degree, which is 24 courses. If you're an existing advisor, in recognition of the fact that you are an existing person working and you have a skill set, we've said do a graduate diploma, which is 8 courses. So it's a 2/3 discount before you started.
Yep.
And then we've sat down and looked at, well, what else have you done that a university would recognise as being at bachelor level or higher through your CPD over time? So that's included study to do your for FPA, or it might be chartered accounting, or it could be CPAs or whatever. And so we give a credit to that. Or if you've done a degree that's relevant to your thing, you get credit for that. So for a lot of those advisors, it starts at 8 at a maximum, but the actual number comes down further. But we have to stay true to the legislation, which is bachelor level or higher.
Okay. Just a question coming in, and maybe one for you, Dante, for both of you, but maybe start with Dante. Just any views on what's been described in the question as mid-tier financial advice, e.g. sitting between general and holistic advice, and what that looks like in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I and the FPA have been, on the record about advice is advice. So we have some strong opinions about general advice, and obviously I note the Westpac case. And there is research to show that consumers get confused when you start having different labels. Ultimately, from a consumer perspective, have they got advice or not? And then any spectrum in the middle, I think, gets a bit confusing. In saying that, also recognise that not everyone and not every consumer wants holistic financial planning. So we have to cater for consumer demand and consumer need and consumer want. And part of that is, pieces of advice when they want it. I mean, you mentioned life stages as an example. And I think we can do a better job in providing advice and tailoring it for when the client needs it and when they want it and when they need it for that point in time. And I look at it very differently and say, if you had a client that maybe comes to you every couple of years based on a life event, over that period of time, they actually do get holistic financial planning. It's just that they're getting it in chunks. The question is whether we can deliver it under the current regime. So we talk about limited advice or scaled advice. We talk about intra-fund advice, and then there's specialty advice. I believe we can. And, you know, one of the things that has come up in the guidance as an example, but even in current regulation, is around, you know, doing full fact finds and et cetera. If we were to look at all pieces of SOAs today, most of them would not be holistic SOAs. They would be limited in some way, shape or form. And I still also subscribe to the fact that as the practitioner, you still need to know your client. So even though you might only deliver a piece of advice, you still need to know that client as well as you can to then be able to give that advice, even if it might be limited. And this is where the tension comes in. So in a roundabout way, we have to be able to deliver pieces of advice when the client needs it. I think the current rules do permit it. We just have to be better at doing a good job at it. And it doesn't mean doing shortcuts, and it doesn't mean, you know, it doesn't mean leading a client to a solution that you want, because that's a solution that works for you and your organisation. And so we just have to be, you know, I think if we stick true to, okay, well, what does the client need and what's in the client's interest here, then I think everything else takes care of itself. And I know that people look at me and say, well, you know, it's not as easy as that. I appreciate it's not as easy as that. But we do need to find a solution, because consumers don't want, and this goes back to cost and affordability, they don't want holistic financial plans. And they want advice that is digestible and deals with a problem that they have today. And we have to learn how to deliver it.
All right, well, we're up on time, guys. Thanks very much for sharing the conversation. I mean, I think we probably all agree that the Australian consumer superannuant's at the centre of all of this, and I'm very hopeful and confident they will be far better off, as they are already, as our industry continues to develop and further professionalises. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks.